evening, everyone. Welcome to Housmans. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For those of you who haven't been to one of our events before, Housmans is one of the oldest and few remaining radical bookshops in the UK. We're based in King's Cross and we're currently open in-store and for online orders, but our events program is entirely online. So we're very grateful that you've chosen to join us over Zoom. And we have a lot more talks and discussions coming up over the next few weeks. And if you want to take a look at our website, you can find out everything that's coming up and book tickets and things like that there. Thank you especially to those of you who are here tonight who've bought solidarity tickets. It's so important to us that we keep these events as affordable and accessible as possible. So by buying a solidarity ticket, you help us keep running them, and we're very grateful. We're thrilled to have all of you here, and we're joined tonight by Chris Saltmarsh and Sam Knights. Chris is the co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal. He's written for a wide range of media, including Novara, Tribune, Jacobin, The Ecologist, openDemocracy, Vice, and New Internationalist. He's the author of Burnt, Fighting for Climate Justice, which is published by Pluto Press as part of their Outspoken series, and that's what he's going to be discussing tonight. Sam is a writer, actor, and climate activist. He helped set up Extinction Rebellion and is the editor of This Is Not a Drill, which was published by Penguin in 2019. He organizes with Momentum and other climate justice groups in the UK. This is a webinar setup, which means that we can't see you or hear you in the audience. So if you've got any comments and chat that you'd like to have going on, there's a chat box down at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions for our speakers, there's also a Q&A box to post them. You can ask questions anonymously, you can upvote other questions that you want to see answered, and we'll be keeping an eye on both of them throughout the chat, throughout the evening. If you feel like tweeting about the event, we are at Housmans Bookshop, and I will post links to all of our socials and how you can buy the book through our website in the chat box below. And with that, I'm going to disappear and let you watch the event. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to Housmans for hosting this conversation. It's so important that we have these conversations in public platforms and forums, and here's to many, many more in the years to come. So before we begin, I guess it sort of falls on me to provide a little bit of context for our chat. And today we're going to be talking about the climate and ecological emergency, and specifically kind of how we as activists, as socialists in the UK, respond to that. This year has been a year on the trajectory as we expected. We've seen flooding and wildfires all across Europe. Madagascar has been hit by deadly famine. India has suffered extreme drought. A town in Pakistan has reached temperatures that are beyond the threshold that the human body is able to withstand. We now know that people are very much living and indeed dying through the climate and ecological emergency. And we need to do more in order to address this. And yet we also know that our governments and our politicians are doing very little to do so. We know that we are not on track to meet our already incredibly weak climate targets. And even if we were to meet those weak climate targets, we know that globally we are still on track for roughly 3 degrees of warming. We know that the IPCC says that we need to limit temperature rises to below 1.5 degrees. And this is extremely important. I know it sort of sounds very abstract to talk in these kind of technical terms, but what we're talking here is a matter of life and death. The difference between fractions of degrees is quite literally the death and displacement of hundreds of millions of people. And so that is the sort of context in which we're having this debate, and it's kind of important to keep that in our mind, right? And yet also to be invested in how it is as individual activists and as movements here in the United Kingdom, we're responding to events on the ground too. And so we're using as a kind of kickstart of our discussion, the book that Chris has written called Burnt, Fighting for Climate Justice, which has just been published by Pluto Press, and is a brilliant examination of the climate movement at the moment and the context in which we find ourselves, and offers some very exciting thoughts on how to get out of it. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with you, Chris, about everything in that book tonight. But I was wondering, maybe we could just start with something a little bit more personal, because in many ways the book is about kind of how we have got here and where we go from here. And I'm just interested, I suppose, in your own personal journey up to this point. So how did you become a climate activist?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks very much, Sam, for agreeing to have this chat this evening. I think it will be interesting. Yeah, how did I kind of become a climate activist? Well, it's one of those where I'd always kind of been interested in the environment and climate change. And I'd always, as a teenager, I'd always kind of thought of it as something that was, disproportionately important compared to, the attention that it was given. And then, I did some kind of relatively liberal climate eco campaigning at college, kind of meat-free Mondays, stop flying, that kind of annoying stuff that you always kind of characterize environmentalists as doing. And then, in my first week at university, where I studied in Sheffield, I joined the People and Planet Society and the fossil fuel divestment campaign. And I think really I kind of treat that, as close to 7 years ago, to last week or something, as my kind of induction into the climate justice movement. So I'd been an environmentalist in some ways, but I think I've entered the climate justice movement as an 18-year-old in that first week of university with the divestment campaign. And really over that kind of year, I got quite heavily involved in it. And by the end of the year, I was coordinating the divestment campaign. And 6 months after that, we won it. And, that was all very exciting. And, I think I got a real political education actually in being involved in that bit of the climate movement, a real kind of sense of antagonism with the fossil fuel industry and capital more generally. And I began to make other connections. So I ended up going along to, direct action camps to shut down coal mines, and went along to COP21 in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was signed, and took part in creative actions, direct actions alongside, indigenous peoples who'd come over. And then from there, kind of, again, got involved in a bit more direct action. So, I joined kind of Reclaim the Power and was involved in the anti-fracking movement. So, ended up, taking part in actions blockading the fracking site in Lancashire. And eventually kind of ended up working for NGOs. So I ended up working on the divestment campaign nationally. And then I've subsequently worked on campaigns around banks financing fossil fuels and insurance companies supporting the fossil fuel industry kind of through NGOs. So I think I've really kind of, done the student side of it, direct action, worked in NGOs. And I think, more recently, the journey I've kind of come on. And I think what's worth saying is that throughout that time, I was an active member of the climate justice movement, but I was also a socialist. I was also a leftist. And I think my experience of that is by no means unique, but I always felt that I was, not common in being, both a very committed leftist as well as a very committed climate activist. And so very often I'll be in a leftist space and perhaps be the only person kind of actively engaged in climate organizing, or I'd be in a climate space and perhaps be the only person, very, very willing to and confident talking about, my socialism, for example. So that was kind of my experience. And I guess, over the last few years, especially with, Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, certainly as a catalyst, I think I've kind of gravitated much more into the kind of the Labour movement, the organised left, as the kind of space through which I've done my climate organising. So with some comrades, set up Labour for a Green New Deal over 2.5 years ago now, probably close to 3 years ago that we kind of really started getting going. And I think for me, that was a maturing of my climate politics, as well as, really beginning to reckon with, well, if we are going to, decarbonize in this country or achieve anything close to climate justice, there needs to be a reckoning of, well, we probably need to elect a government. And for me, that government probably needs to be a Labour one. But, at that time, even with a progressive Labour leadership, the party was absolutely nowhere close to being where it needed to be. So that was a kind of logical next step for me. So I think, it's been that progression. And again, I think I'm lucky to have, comrades and connections right across the climate movement and also the Labour movement now. And I think, for me, that kind of journey is almost a kind of encapsulation of what, always an argument in the book, right, that, I want to see a kind of synthesizing or a bringing together of the left and the climate movement, because I think, together we're stronger, and it, in this kind of crucial next decades or century, we really need to be working in the same direction.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks. And I think that's really helpful, because I think in many ways your journey through this charts the journey of the book too, right? In that there is evidently kind of a quiet narrative happening underneath it all, which is like this learning that happens through doing the action, doing the work, and the journey that politics goes on, sort of mirroring that ideological step by step as well. I want to kind of focus today's chat on strategy and kind of where we go from here. But in order to do that, obviously, we do have to look backwards. And so we'll go through NGO politics, and we'll go through direct action and Extinction Rebellion and other climate justice organizations. And then we'll look towards, I guess, the future. But before we do that, just to kind of ground it within the eco-socialist framework in which both me and you operate in, I guess I'm interested in where that sort of anti-capitalist approach to the climate crisis for you began to develop, and was there a moment which for you the kind of like penny dropped and you thought, okay, these two crises are indivisible, or has it been much more a sort of slower sort of sense of critique?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that there was a kind of penny dropping moment. And I think, this kind of comes back to the fact that I was always a socialist, and so always had a kind of anti-capitalism. And, from my early days in the climate justice movement, it was involved in divestment. And, I think I have criticisms of the divestment movement and its impact and its power, but I think at its very core was an anti-corporate critique. And, even if it wasn't explicitly anti-capitalist, its orientation was against corporate power. And so that was always kind of there for me. And it was, I'm lucky to have always been involved in a kind of, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, kind of anti-capitalist climate politics. I guess for me, that critique or that analysis has sharpened over the years. And I think that, being involved in the divestment movement was interesting, actually, because there is something of a divide where you kind of have the radicals who, are very much, well, this is a kind of first step, and ultimately, the aim is to dismantle the fossil fuel industry, and that has to, be quite decisive, and and it needs very material kind of policies or interventions to make that happen. And I guess the other side of the divestment movement is maybe a more liberal side of things, where it's like, well, divestment itself is a good tool, and it's kind of almost a market-oriented solution, and actually, if we just kind of decarbonize investment portfolios, then that's possible, that's fine. We just kind of marginalize the fossil fuel industry, and broadly speaking, capitalism kind of carries on. Not to say it's perfect, but it kind of carries on, and we do have ecological collapse, which is an understandably seductive position for some people. But I think, I guess the point I'm making is being in that movement and having that tension and navigating that tension, I think did sharpen my anti-capitalism, because I was very much coming up against people within the same movement or the same bit of the movement that actually didn't have as strong a kind of anti-capitalist analysis. And so what it forced me to do was really refine that and really kind of, maybe it hardened me actually in that respect. But I guess it forced me to think about it, and it wasn't a kind of, it went from being, I guess, a kind of assumed anti-capitalism or an implicit anti-capitalism to actually a very intentional one, where I became increasingly confident of making that argument within the movement. And I guess, the other thing I'd say is that being involved in direct action movements, again, it's not necessarily a very dominant politics. And I think it's an interesting one where I think if you asked most people who are involved in anti-fracking direct action, or presumably in Extinction Rebellion or the strikes or anything like that, most people would probably describe themselves as being anti-capitalist. Maybe they would, if you were like, what's your politics? Maybe it wouldn't come up first time, but if you're like, are you an anti-capitalist? I would imagine most people would say yes. I think instructively, all of the Green Party leadership candidates recently, when asked, all said that they were anti-capitalist. Not that that's necessarily their prime messaging, but it's, there's this kind of soft anti-capitalism that's almost necessarily present within the environmental movement. But I think there's kind of a next step to does that go to a real not sophisticated, but a kind of confident or a deeper kind of anti-capitalism that really feels, does it go from a well, the system's obviously fucked, to a well, I can actually explain what it is about the system that is wrong and what we want to change. I think the crucial thing is that the anti-capitalism may be there, but very rarely does it translate to socialism. And I think that's the real difference in the, if everyone at a Reclaim the Power camp or, an anti-fracking direct action might say, say 90% of them say they're anti-capitalists, to 10% say they're socialists. I've never done a poll, but, maybe. And I guess that's the difference. And I think it was through that kind of constant talking to people, organizing in spaces, almost having pushed back against my own politics, and kind of really having to learn how to communicate it like within a space that wasn't explicitly like a left space, that almost helped me kind of almost become clearer that it was so foundational, and read not to be a kind of theory bro or anything, but reading things as well. I think there are some really excellent kind of contributions from people like Andreas Malm and Jason Moore and others, Naomi Klein, who have really put capitalism on the hook, and I think they've done so in quite a compelling way. But I think as time passes, I think the proposition that we can resolve the crisis within the system we have becomes increasingly unconvincing, because the time has run out for capitalism to kind of viably say that it was prepared to deal with it. It would have dealt with it by now if that was going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just in case any of those people are watching, what is the problem with capitalism, right? So I guess you're absolutely right in the kind of mainstream liberal climate movement. You'll often hear the kind of slogans really being bandied around, right? Like limitless growth on a finite planet is impossible, etc., etc. And there is a kind of internalized anti-capitalist logic there. Likewise, if you talk about the kind of built-in obsolescence on your phones, and there's a kind of anti-technology politics which is connected to anti-consumerism, which goes on to anti-consumption. And I think there is a kind of like generalized understanding of these things, but in terms of a more sustained critique of capitalism, it's not really there. So, without wanting the Communist Manifesto from you, what is incompatible about capitalism and the climate crisis, and then why is eco-socialism the answer for you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to be as brief as possible on it, because I think brevity on this question is useful. For me, it really boils down to capitalism as a system. It structures the economy so that making a profit is the most important thing you can do, and that's really the primary motivation for any kind of actor, especially businesses and privately owned companies. And what that does is it means any other consideration, social justice, human rights, workers' rights, the environment, the climate, becomes necessarily secondary. And it's not to say that it's entirely marginalized, because obviously we have some workers' rights. The climate isn't as bad as it might be. There are some environmental protections. It's not to say that, as I say, the profit motive totally marginalizes all of the considerations, but it does trump it. And, I think we're in a situation where any of, the measures that we need to take to decarbonize, to achieve climate justice, social justice as well, aren't necessarily going to be profitable for capital, for the people who own and run the economy. It's going to require a lot of investment. It's not going to necessarily be it's going to be a lot of initial spending. It's not necessarily going to make a whole load of money back immediately. It's not happened. It's not going to happen on the timetable that we need if the profit motive continues to be like the primary consideration. And that's because ultimately capitalism is a system where it needs to kind of constantly accumulate. It kind of can't take a pause. It can't take 10 years to say, okay, well, we'll sort this ecological mess out and then we'll get back to the business of making a profit. That's just not how it works. And so why socialism? Ultimately it's almost the opposite system, where rather than the economy and land or the means of producing things being owned by a really tiny number of people who are only prioritizing profit, we put all of that stuff in the hands of people, whether it's mediated through the state or cooperatives or whatever the kind of form is, people like you or I or anyone else who can have a democratic say of how we run the economy and ultimately don't have to put profit first. We can make that choice together to prioritize having a stable climate, having good rights and conditions, and that's and why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we when we're talking about what is an existential crisis? So yeah, that's a very sure, that's certainly not an extensive account of what eco-socialism would be, but I think the real crux of it is that we can, if we can own things publicly, they don't have to be subordinated to the profit motive.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really helpful thing just to kind of root the discussion. I mean, one of the things I really like about the book is that it doesn't get too bogged down in those kind of debates, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I kind of have this sense at the moment that there are far too many books being written about the climate crisis that just say the same thing, like we're fucked, right? And that's it. And then there isn't really a kind of strategic analysis that goes beyond that. And so it's really helpful to kind of think through those questions in the book when reading. I should have said before, absolutely, if anyone has any questions, drop them in the chat and I will absolutely try to ask them. But maybe we could move on now to talking about the state of the British climate movement as it currently stands, because these are the kind of vehicles that we are looking at and the organizing context in which any sort of eco-socialist strategy has to both be conscious of and in many cases form coalitions and collaborations with. So maybe let's start with the kind of more professionalized wing of the climate movement and NGO politics. What are the limitations of an organization like Greenpeace?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and it's a big part of the book. And in some ways, I think it's, it's not that I'm the first person to have said this, but I think it's perhaps one of the more original contributions, almost kind of writing these frustrations that a lot of us have down. I think often when you think of the climate movement, an ordinary, your kind of classic layperson would think, what are the organizations of the climate movement? Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, maybe the Sierra Club if you're in the US. But, so these organizations, they dominate the movement. And that's, I think, why they're important to focus on. This isn't us kind of slagging off a marginal sect. These are big institutions. They have a lot of money, they have a lot of resources, more so than I would imagine any group that you or I have been involved in. These are international organizations that, as you say, very professionalized. And so through that resource, what they're able to do is, dominate the narrative. And so I often notice if there's a climate, change story in the news, it will be Greenpeace or another such organization that is quoted. And so in that very kind of obvious way, they get to really kind of, influence what the mainstream narrative on this stuff is. And I guess, my criticism, and this comes from working with these NGOs, sometimes in them, and it's also worth, caveating that I've got a lot of very good friends who work or have worked with them and good comrades, and there's lots of very good people in them who I think are constrained by the organization and do good work. And, again, it's not to say that these organizations don't do any good work, of course they do. But I think the real kind of challenge I think they present is they have a kind of, they have an ideological politics, which I think they wouldn't, necessarily, volunteer. And I think we can probably describe it pretty basically as, a kind of liberalism. It's a kind of very socially liberal approach. So, would certainly tend to acknowledge things like racism and sexism and colonialism even. But ultimately kind of would very rarely go so far as to, we're talking about capitalism, to really put capitalism on the hook. So I think, these organizations will sometimes be quite ambitious in terms of, how quickly do we need to decarbonize? But what they kind of have a kind of almost structural or certainly ideological inability to do is really define the kind of real nature of the crisis and as such propose, radical solutions. And so very rarely would you have an NGO talk about public ownership or democratic ownership of the economy. Or they might talk about a just transition, but they wouldn't substantially talk about a really worker-led economy, what that means. And so what that does mean is that, the kind of dominant organizations of the movement almost set the, they set the tone, and the kind of implicit demands of the movement become a quite technocratic, quite like abstracted policy-driven kind of approach. And that's what, government, government, the opposition, whoever, that's kind of what they hear, that's what they get. And, I think it's interesting to think about like why this is. I think on the one hand, I think we can understand it as a cultural thing. This is a set of institutions that have, been set up, and there's a kind of professionalization, there's a kind of bureaucracy, and in some ways that's like necessarily like moderating in politics. But also I think, we can think about it structurally, and I think how these organizations are funded is also very significant. Some of them, maybe like Greenpeace, actually are reliant on like donors, like, it might be big donors from wealthy people, it might be kind of medium-sized donors from kind of, your middle-class people who, want to do some, don't do anything but want to give some of their money to Greenpeace, whatever. And I think these donor bases actually tend to be quite conservative. So if you're getting money disproportionately from individuals or families or whatever who aren't radicals, then, as soon as you kind of step up to radicalism, then maybe you lose some of your funding base. And then I guess it's also worth saying that NGOs aren't just your Greenpeaces and your Friends of the Earth, which kind of are able to fund themselves basically through this through their brand recognition. It's a whole ecology of dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations in Europe and in the US, certainly, which are kind of more medium and smaller, which all play different roles, and a lot of them do very good work. But those types of the kind of medium-sized organizations can be up to like 80, 90, 100% funded from like philanthropic trusts, which essentially is the kind of chicken feed of capital. So it's like, maybe you've got a particularly enlightened capitalist who's really concerned about climate change, and maybe it's for tax reasons. I don't know what motivates these people. But anyway, the funding they're getting is from a trust or a foundation, which is like basically like, from like the super rich. And so again, you're in this situation where even if you have a medium-sized NGO that's staffed full of leftists, there's a kind of barrier on what you can do, because you're not going to get more funding from your kind of philanthropic trust if you're criticizing the system, the economic system of capitalism that has like enriched them. And so I think that these organizations' reliance on this type of funding, not from members, these aren't democratic member-led organizations. That's like a real limitation. And again, I think in terms of a limitation they can place on the movement, I think if you were to make a case for NGOs, you would say, well, there's certainly use in having some degree of professionalization within the movement. There's a use in it allows you to scale, it allows you to almost do the dirty work that like a kind of activist, grassroots activist volunteering their time wouldn't want to do, wouldn't be able to do. Like, it allows you to produce a pretty professional report. It allows you to do some research. It allows you to, to poll, to develop branding. And so, that would be the argument for these organizations being necessary. But I guess the counter argument would be that they suck up grassroots activists into their structures, and you get a lot of people who may be involved in direct action or come up in grassroots groups, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm doing this basically full time along to my full time job. Why don't I just do this full time and get paid for it? And it's a very, for any individual, like, you wouldn't blame them, would you? I've done it myself. But what it means is they get co-opted, and ultimately you get to a situation where people are kind of trying their best to work through these organizations. As I said before, they're not democratic organizations. And you compare them to organizations in the labor movement on the left. Trade unions are imperfect, and I'm sure we'll get onto it, but they're democratic. They're funded by members, and there are mechanisms for members to have a say. Sorry, but with NGOs, they're essentially structured like corporations. So you have a CEO, you have a bloated middle management, you have kind of very disempowered like junior staff, and the staff don't really have a say in the direction. Member supporters don't. And so, you have this situation where NGOs kind of operating along this liberal ideology, but there's kind of no real recourse for the rest of the movement to kind of discipline them.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of CEOs, I've just seen that the CEO of Greenpeace position is now vacant. So if any comrades do want to apply for that and distribute the money more equitably around other smaller NGOs and indeed climate justice activist groups, then please do. I guess so. Just a sort of small additional question on the NGOs point, because as you say, this is something that I think environmental activists really enjoy complaining about, right? So like, I think one of the things that struck me when throwing myself into the climate movement for the first time was the extreme levels of animosity against organizations like Greenpeace. And I couldn't get my head around it. And I think eventually I understood that it was a kind of generational. I mean, I think a lot of the climate movement has kind of like daddy issues around Greenpeace, right? Like it was seen as this kind of radical organization, although I think the radicalism of Greenpeace is largely overblown actually now. But it's seen as at least this radical organization which then went through a period of bureaucratization and therefore has ditched what could have been an effective vehicle for achieving change. And I think there is a really legitimate critique there. But then there is also this kind of like overreaction that sometimes appears in the climate movement, at least, which then is distilled into a kind of anti all forms of NGO isms. And, recently climate activists sort of throwing pink paint over the HQ of Greenpeace. And I wonder then what is the kind of best way for an emerging eco-socialist movement or climate activists in general to engage with these incredibly flawed institutions, right? How do we take the critique of them whilst also not making them the focus of our own activism?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it kind of a climate activism that essentially engages in like self-indulgent friendly fire is ultimately just like, yeah, it's not the one. How do you take that forward? Yeah, I mean, I think, first thing for like any individual, I think, if you're a climate activist, if you work for an NGO, I think that's probably a reckoning you have to have with yourself. And I'm not going to tell any individual like, don't work, quit your job, like absolutely not. But it has to be like, if you're working for an NGO, how are you like maximizing the resources in that organization? How are you being as movement generous as possible? Or is your time best served doing something else? Like actually, for a lot of radicals working for NGOs, would your time be better spent quitting your job, getting a like quote unquote normal job, and being a climate activist on the side, or like organizing your workplace for your trade union and agitating for your trade union to be better on planet stuff? That's a choice for individuals to make, and I'm not gonna tell anyone what they should do. But I think it's just like something that you do need to reckon with basically as an individual, and it's something that I've reckoned with, having worked for some of these organizations. And I guess the more kind of like movement-wide thing would be, I think, and again, it's it's easy to say this, and it's like I'm not building this, and nobody that I know is building this, but like I do think we need to build like some mechanism for like movement democracy, where, and I don't know exactly what that would look like. Would it be one organization? A really difficult thing in the climate movement is like, who's our base? Like if you're a trade union, like your base is workers. The youth strikes. The youth strikes did a good job because they had a really clear base, kids. So who's your base is like the real challenge in this. But like, do you build a kind of mass member organization, like an eco-socialist member organization, maybe, or do you build, are you working through like another organization? Basically, I think there needs to be some mechanism for democracy in the movement, and I think with that you could begin to subordinate NGOs to the democracy a bit more, and you could begin to say, well, okay, Greenpeace, like, yeah, you're here, like, great, good job of like getting all this resource, like, but now this democratic organization or whatever it is process is setting the direction, setting demands, setting the kind of like toolkit of strategy, tactics, or the kind of broad strategy. And we're going to use the broad movement's resources accordingly towards this. And if not, then there's issues type thing. So that would be my kind of, broad proposition of like, and I didn't really go into that very much in the book. I've kind of been thinking about it a lot more recently, but that would be my kind of broad proposition. And what I do say in the book is like, I think NGOs essentially need to subordinate themselves to like almost the kind of like socialist leadership that's like emerging, the kind of youth strikes, Green New Deal, XR, if you like, kind of, bit. We need to have a recognition of like, this is where the momentum is. This is where, if anything in this country is going to take us in this direction, it's going to be this kind of tendency that's arising. And yeah, if you're an NGO, you need to be quite conscious about how you're supporting that and like not getting in the way. So again, it's not an easy answer, but I think that is the kind of conversation we need to start having.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to direct action and the efficacy of direct action, and I guess its place in the climate movement, which you spend quite a lot of the book talking about. And I wonder if you could maybe just outline your thoughts on when direct action is useful and what role it has in sort of the climate movement.
Yeah, sorry for the excessive drinking. I've had the end of a cold. And I know it says Hugh or like some kind of millennial socialist. Yeah, direct action is a fascinating one, I think. I've been involved, as I said, I've been involved in direct action. I've taken direct action against the fracking industry, against coal. And I think for like radicals in the environmental movement, this kind of direct action has been like a default almost. Like that's kind of like, that's the most radical thing to do. And if you're a radical climate justice person, like your kind of like imperative is to be involved, not necessarily getting arrested, but to be involved in some way in shutting down like fossil fuel infrastructure or something. And I guess, part of reflecting around the book, and I guess, part of the impetus for setting up Labour for a Green New Deal is that kind of like very defensive, like resistance strategy, like only takes you so far. And I guess like my frustration when we were doing anti-fracking stuff was that I think, the anti-fracking movement in the UK pretty chaotically, but also effectively did a pretty good job of like stopping the emergence of a new industry, which like had it not existed could have been pretty fucking terrible. You know what I mean? Like there could be like dozens, if not, you know, more fracking sites around the UK now had the anti-fracking movement not existed. Like it's kind of factual, it's like who knows, but like, you know, the industry may have just been doomed, but I think we did a pretty good job of like stopping it basically. You know, with all the kind of caveats of like, as I say, the chaos and the disorganization of the whole endeavor. So it's not, yeah, but I guess like my feeling was always that it was like we were resisting like a very, very, very small bit of fossil capital, and that like for every fracking site you stop, or every coal mine you get shut down, like just like loads more get set up without any opposition. And like, you know, I think Endigalenda, you know, I've got a lot of great comrades who are really involved in Endigalenda. That's probably like the, you know, in Europe, the pinnacle of like this kind of like anti-fossil fuel infrastructure direct action, and it's been really, you know, probably been quite responsible for like coal phase out in Germany and stuff. But again, for me, it's always like that's in a context of fossil fuel infrastructure continuing to expand, like around Europe. You know, like the European Commission has like a kind of projects of common interest program where it just like directly politically and financially supports pipelines going across Europe. And, you know, China's a really difficult one. Obviously, it's kind of changed its policy really recently, but, you know, for a long time, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, was just like building loads of coal, or it was this plan on like pipelines like across Asia and into Europe as well. And it was, yeah, I always just felt like direct action was like, felt like an important part of what we were doing, but could never have successfully been the whole. And what was missing was like an associated political strategy. That's kind of what I'm getting around to here. Like, I always felt that what the climate movement lacked was like a real political strategy to not just like influence whatever the government happened to be, which is a kind of NGO model of like, we just want to see at the table, we just want you to like read our policy papers, but to like seriously like have an ambition to like transform the economy. And like, yeah, as I say, although people in those kind of movements would have like said they were anti-capitalists, like there was never, for a long time, I think in this country, like the climate movement never had like a serious program for like actually like building something serious, or like actually like instituting like serious transformations on our terms. And so I think, yeah, the kind of point that I came to is like, my kind of ideal would be, you know, you have a political climate movement that like seeks to engage a mass of people. And that's the other thing, you know, direct action stuff is necessarily marginal. Like, and actually one of my frustrations with the anti-fracking movement was that when I was involved in it, was that, you know, you can kind of shut down a fracking site for like half a day or a day with like 6 people who know each other really well and are on like a signal group together. But it takes a lot of human resource to do that like day after day after day. But what we could have done is if we'd have mobilized like 200 people, you know, every day, we wouldn't need anyone to get arrested. They just like stood outside and like you functionally shut it down. But, you know, so the kind of fetishization of direct action is like necessarily marginal. And like for me, that's fine if you want to resist one specific thing. But what we want to do is transform the whole economy. And that necessarily requires like winning a social majority of people round to you. And like I just think for a long time the climate movement like was really fixated on like tactics that was actually counter to that. And so that's why I need to build a political movement that like seeks to work through democracy, however flawed our liberal democracies may be, work through the kind of existing institutions we have as a civil society, like trade unions, like political parties, and kind of do it that way. And then like have elements of the movement that deploy direct action, for example, when they're trying to set up a new fracking site, but have that be deployed quite carefully, I think, and like in ways that actually tie into your political messaging that will win support rather than alienate people. Yeah, so as I say, it's like, you know, I'm taking part in direct action. I may very well do in the future, but right now I think the real priority in the climate movement is to actually build like a serious political strategy, which, you know, I think we're getting there, but still a long way to go.
Yeah, great. Let's move on to, I guess, maybe the sort of epitome of direct action protest then, which is the sort of current British climate movement context. What happened in 2019 and 18, the emergence of the school strikes and also Extinction Rebellion, which kind of at its heart is a direct action mass movement, and has introduced many new activists, I think, to that kind of politics. I'm wondering, I guess, whether your opinion of Extinction Rebellion has changed over time, and if so, how you feel about it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think my opinion of it has to have changed because XR has changed, and you'll know that as much as anyone. For anyone who doesn't know, I think I don't want to kind of make this claim and be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I was the first person, certainly on the left, to publicly criticize XR. So, which was a great morning for my Twitter notifications.
Yeah, I remember being so annoyed at this bloke called Chris Saltmarsh.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, good time. This was only 3 years ago, which is crazy. But yeah, and I guess the reason why I did that, I wrote an article for Novara Media, was I had been around people who were involved in setting it up or around it before it launched. I met Roger Hallam, and I just got bad vibes basically. And people I knew were getting really involved, and they were asking me for my views and stuff, and I was telling them. And that was kind of an internal debate, an organization I was involved in about whether to ally with them or not. And basically, we got to a point where a lot of people in the climate movement who I knew were kind of messaging me privately, being this XR thing that's just launched or is about to launch, what do you think? And I basically had put together a briefing of this is my understanding of what's happening with it. These are my views on it. Do what you want with that. And at some point, enough people were asking me that I thought it would be useful to publish it. And obviously, the title of the article was quite clickbait of 5 reasons I'm not joining Extinction Rebellion. I kind of wouldn't have necessarily named it that myself, but it probably got the views or the reads that it wouldn't have otherwise. So, fair enough. I don't work in media for a reason. I write the words, I don't brand them. But yeah, and I guess to be really quick about it, my kind of initial criticisms or my concerns were I was concerned by a strategy that was predicated on mass arrests. I thought that could be quite harmful for the movement and maybe irresponsible. And actually, I think on that, although it kind of wouldn't necessarily be my approach, I do think one of the criticisms that people at XR took up and really mitigated for very early was that concern around welfare. And I think actually what XR probably does better than a lot of other organizations is talk about and actually put into practice a regenerative culture. And Sam, you'll know much better than me whether that is realized and whether people do regenerate or whether actually burnout is still a thing. Who am I to judge? But I think that was an initial criticism, and I think that's something certainly that I think we can recognize as being dealt with in some way. Obviously, I criticized the politics of it, or lack thereof. I at that time even I was arguing, that we shouldn't go beyond politics. We should have an explicit, the climate crisis is a political thing, and and we should build a movement as such. But again, I think we have to acknowledge that. And my take on this is that the kind of apolitics of XR is at the same time, it's prime reason for its success. It mobilized people that hadn't previously been mobilized by the climate movement because it was apolitical, because people kind of wanted this, they wanted this thing that was is this a vehicle to take action on this climate crisis that people were quite concerned about without having to get, without having to take a position on things. And I guess the more an organization takes a position on something, the less people you can mobilize, because the more people there are to disagree with you. So I think we have to understand the mobilizing effects of the beyond politics thing. But I do maintain that it's also the movement's biggest limitation. And so it's at the same time, was the reason for it being successful, but it's also it can only take you so far. Sure, you can mobilize some thousands of people, but what do you do with them then? What do you do after you've been co-opted by the government, or what do you do after you've been co-opted by liberal political parties? So I think that was a big kind of learning, and I think something really interesting. And I guess maybe one of the other kind of original criticisms was probably around almost kind of the foundational mythology of it. And I think a lot, and you get a lot of this it's a kind of political theory, which I'm just not very much of a fan of. That was kind of Roger Hallam and that write about, which it's kind of the whole justification for we're gonna get as many people as possible to take action and get loads of them arrested, and then there'll be a critical mass. And there's just this kind of logical leap that I just think has never been quite bridged, where there's a kind of cherry picking of history, and it's kind of this whole the kind of US social movement theory of mobilizing 3.5% of the population being based on very dodgy studies, as far as I'm concerned. which kind of had this kind of like mobilize loads of people, like question mark profit, and I think it kind of had this initial narrative of like, oh well, just kind of drawing on like a very like abstracted or idealized like interpretation of like what happened with Gandhi or like Martin Luther King, and like and a very kind of like, I think, basic unrefined politics, which told quite an uncompelling for me story of like how you would almost like overthrow a government. And again, it's one of those where like, that's very much, I think, there are still some people within XR or around it who would be quite dogmatic about that stuff. But again, I think it's probably matured politically, and like, you've had things like the global justice intervention, which was obviously very significant. And, people like yourself who are like very involved, who, kind of tried to like refine it in those ways. So, it would be crude and incorrect to say that it hadn't matured. And I guess just the last thing I'll say on this is like, I do think it's important to recognize that also like the strategic orientation of XR has shifted, and I think it's quite clearly gone from a place where, and this is the kind of like Roger Hallam theory of how you do it, of like generalized civil disobedience. And actually I would contend this isn't direct action, right? A kind of generalized civil disobedience where you're basically trying to escalate, shut down as much of the economy as you can, and the theory is that like you get to a certain level where you hit a critical mass, and maybe a revolution happens, or maybe the government concedes to other matters, or it's kind of question marks there. It's kind of gone, and I think there was a lot of backlash around that. The kind of like people didn't like blocking buses in working class parts of London or blocking random roads, and it's kind of pivoted almost to a more targeted thing. And as I know, actions that you've done were kind of targeting Shell, or targeting Barclays, or very recently. Was targeting them. The recent rebellion was targeting the City of London, which the kind of financial institutions responsible for financing fossil fuels. And again, I don't agree with it, but the kind of like the focus on HS2 as like a specific project, probably a different time to like talk about the specific politics of HS2, but the HS2 rebellion is like a focus on a specific bit of infrastructure you don't like, and so it's like there's certainly a pivot like away from that generalized civil disobedience towards a more targeted approach. And I'm kind of torn about it. Like in some ways, as much as I criticized it, in some ways I did kind of think that the generalized civil disobedience stuff like was XR's like niche, and it's like there was always a tension there, but it did achieve a lot in some ways, and in some ways it's kind of like, well, is it now just kind of moderating and becoming a kind of just integrating itself into the existing climate movement? Like, is it kind of stripping away the bits that made it kind of insurgent? So I'm not really sure on that. But I guess, the last thing I just comment is like, I think with the generalized civil disobedience stuff, I think everyone's kind of heard of the Canning Town action, which everyone obviously has their opinions on, where they tried to stop, a tube in Canning Town, and like it all went very bad. And I was very critical about the time, and I think most people I speak to are. And I think for me that almost felt like the kind of like, and probably with the Heathrow stuff around a similar time, that almost kind of felt like the kind of last attempt to hegemonize the like generalized civil disobedience model within XR. And I think almost like the failure of that action, to me from an outsider, felt like the failure of that model. And like obviously like people like Roger and his like his allies have like tried to like do similar things adjacent to or separate to XR. So it's not like a dead phenomenon. But for me, that felt like the moment where it's like, oh no, this is now a different thing. Like the majority of people within XR have rejected that. They tried to do it anyway. And it got a load of backlash. And so, to kind of long way of answering your question, in some ways, I think the XR of today is like quite a different beast to the XR of late 2018, early 2019. And so there are still elements of it that I would criticize. The politics, for example, it wouldn't necessarily be a tactical repertoire I would myself endorse or do, but it's kind of like maybe perhaps less controversial. But I think it's honestly I think XR is one of the most fascinating things ever just like occurred ever, for like many reasons, and we could probably do 2 hours of just talking about it. But I know you're asking the questions, but if there's any of that you kind of have thoughts on, I would be particularly interested to hear.
I mean, that's all super interesting. I'm quite reluctant to go into a huge conversation about Extinction Rebellion because I think we would be here for hours. But maybe another time we should just talk about Extinction Rebellion and the lessons we can get from it, because there are some fascinating lessons there. And I'm also conscious that I want to leave time for, our own solutions and things. I don't want to just spend an hour sort of talking about the deficiencies of other people's approaches. But How about one more question on Extinction Rebellion, which for me, or maybe just like rationalizing, I guess, my approach to it, because I share all of your critiques and I've written lots of pieces about those critiques now. And I don't think actually on the kind of substantive politics of things we differ at all. I think for me, it was a question of strategy, of deciding to join Extinction Rebellion. And my own sort of personal journey into climate activism was that I read the IPCC report in 2018, like I'm sure a lot of people did, had a bit of a breakdown and decided I needed to do something about this, and researched all the kind of options that we've already talked about today, and the NGOs weren't offering anything that I thought was even vaguely coherent or commensurate. And there was only really one group at the time that I thought was offering a radical tactical approach to the climate and ecological emergency. And I think that's sometimes sort of forgotten in these conversations, is that like at that point in 2018, there was really one group in the UK that was going, okay, we are going to try and shut the system down and offer a systemic critique in public of this crisis. And we're going to do that in a sustained fashion and with the hope of building a movement, right? And so for me, that was a kind of like tactical question of, do I support this organization? Do I support its aims? Do I support a kind of movement emerging that talks about these issues? And the answer to those questions was yes. And so I ended up kind of, you know, my journey for Extinction Rebellion was that I was very lucky that I'm an actor in my day job, and I'd shot a film and could quit my job. And so I spent a year of my life every day working with Extinction Rebellion, and was kind of at the heart of those conversations of what the movement was and how it was going to approach things. And I think, to be honest, you're right. Like Roger Hallam and his friends lost the argument in terms of, you know, the strategy going forward, but so did myself and, you know, my friends, right? Like it isn't a radical climate justice organization, which is what many of us were pushing it in the direction of, but neither is it what Roger wants it to be either. And so it kind of exists in a very different space now, but is fundamentally a social movement as well. And I think that's as well like something that we sometimes forget in amongst all these left-wing critiques of it, is that it genuinely is a decentralized social movement. And the kind of the focus on Roger Hallam as one of the 10 founders of the movement and his particular theories, I find, you know, sometimes just very frustrating, because that doesn't chime with my experience of what Extinction Rebellion is. And I can't shake the feeling that if the left had got involved with Extinction Rebellion from the beginning, if it had invested energy and time into a vehicle like that, which really captured an energy, a moment in time, then it could be doing amazingly important work and could be a very sort of sustainable model for that kind of politics. I mean, I still think an eco-socialist movement like Extinction Rebellion needs to emerge. And you know, for me, that was it was a tactical question as opposed to a kind of ideological one first and foremost. Where is the question in all of this? I guess the question is, when we look at the state of the British climate movement as it currently is, how do we as individuals and as groups on the kind of eco-socialist left interact with those movements and help them along? Because I think, you know, we have, I think, quite helpfully moved in the last 2 years from a position of sometimes antagonism between the left and the climate movement to one where people are much more collaborative and cooperative. And yet there are still tensions in that dynamic, and sometimes very productive tensions. So if I was a budding climate activist today and I was entering the movement for the first time, and I was disillusioned with the Labour Party and the institutions of that, and I said to you, Chris, I just want to get involved in activism on the ground, what would your kind of response to that be, and what would your just advice on a kind of personal level to someone in that position be?
Yeah, I mean, and thanks, by the way, for those insights. I think they really are fascinating. But yeah, I mean, I guess, I think I would say, go in, whatever you go into, if it's like, a direct action thing against fossil fuel infrastructure, if you join an XR group, if you're joining like a youth strikes group or whatever, I think go in with like a clear, like, ideological politics and kind of an honest accounting of, well, we are often as eco-socialists in the minority in a kind of like classic climate organization, but go in with like an understanding of the terrain and almost like a willingness to struggle over like those politics. And I think you need, as you say, like a collective agitation like towards a more like propositional and a more explicitly socialist climate politics. And it's one of those where it's like, it's not like it's not like the left where you do have reasonably clearly defined like factional lines that fall along ideology. Like the climate movement is almost kind of like, they're taking in some ways. And it's like, I would say it's like dominantly liberal or radical liberal, probably be the most accurate way to describe it. But again, a lot of that is implied or implicit. So yeah, I think don't just kind of get involved and like follow the lead. Like with a lot of these things, it's quite easy to like take leadership positions quite quickly because of their decentralized nature. So yeah, do that and like make connections. I think one of the things I do kind of say in the books, like one of my arguments is like, we do need to build a climate movement through like the institutions of the labor movement, like the Labour Party and the trade unions. But as you say, like not everyone is going to be up for that. Like some people might be opposed for it politically, or they might be disillusioned with those institutions. And like, I'm not saying that like everyone has to, give the hours of your life to like the Labour Party that I do. I wouldn't wish it on, my worst enemy really. But for those people who are engaging in like the grassroots stuff, they do need to have an understanding of like why the labor movement side of things is important. And so again, if you're organizing in like a direct action group or a grassroots group, have an eye at least on the kind of the broader picture of like, well, capturing state power to deliver our kind of socialist transformations is the end point. Electing a socialist labor government is an important part of it. Having an empowered trade union movement is an important part of it. And so don't just like, as much as kind of the work I'm doing is always trying to drag those institutions of the labor movement towards the climate movement. If you're in the climate movement, do some work to drag them in that direction as well, because there is a lot of quite nasty stuff in the kind of climate movement about trade unions that needs countering. And even if it's not nasty, just kind of, relatively like tepid politics that needs invigorating.
Okay, great. I mean, let's talk about the labor movement then and get onto that. I mean, by the way, everybody that is joining this webinar, I know we were advertised to finish at 8:30. I'm keen to try and wrap up way before that, just so we can all enjoy our evenings. We've got a question in the chat, so I'll kind of keep the next section brief, but I think it is really important, which is like, what do we do that have been organizing through the labor movement for the last couple of years? What is our strategy going forward? Obviously, we've just had the Labour Party conference. Both me and you were there trying to push Green New Deal motions through, which we got passed overwhelmingly. But then, 3 hours later, Keir Starmer is on television saying we don't believe any of this stuff. The recent rule changes have meant that it's going to be increasingly hard for a progressive leader to emerge in the Labour Party. Various institutional changes in unions mean variously similar things. It's looking like a left-wing eco-socialist strategy through the Labour movement is becoming increasingly bleak. So I guess the question is, one, do you have any hope for that? And then secondly, in the time frame that we have, right? Like, I think for all of us, the most important question now is, what can we personally do? Where can our energy go that ensures us the highest probability of achieving decarbonisation by 2030? And is there a road through the institutions of the labour movement to decarbonisation by 2030 still?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the kind of almost the core argument, not the core, a real central argument of the book is like this almost a provocation, but like as much as the climate movement might detest the idea, like we do need basically the ambition to like capture state power, like as a movement, in order to deliver a lot of our ambitions. Capitalism isn't going to do it for us. A kind of, capital's B team isn't going to do it for us either, even kind of social democratic government. So there does need to be that ambition. And again, I think in some ways, the book is obviously like really radical, but in other ways, it's like strategically quite pragmatic, and like it's almost a kind of like attempt to like wrestle with a lot of people in the climate movement and be like, no, this is what we must do this. even if it's really hard. And I think actually for you to kind of outline how difficult it feels like is entirely correct. You know, I hope the book doesn't come across in this way. Like what I don't want it to be is a kind of like, well, we'll take over the Labour Party and we'll win an election and then we'll do eco-socialism. Like, ta-da, brilliant. And then we're all home for tea. You know, that's obviously not going to be the case. And like, you know, the conditions were hard between 2015 and 2019, and they're now obviously like significantly harder. I was talking to someone recently, and I guess the way I described it is like, it's like capturing state power through the Labour Party in the UK to deliver a lot of these things is incredibly difficult and unlikely, but it's simultaneously also the most likely like strategy that we have, like, to do it. And so it's like we kind of have to exist in that balance of like just kind of like doing our best and doing what we can through this strategic route, without kind of deluding ourselves, I guess. And I think the thing for me is like the experience of like organizing through Labour under Corbyn, what I guess it's shown really clearly is that like just focusing on the party alone is like never going to be sufficient, and that, you know, I think we should seek to organize through the party, and we should seek to control it, or we should seek to influence it, but without like a trade union movement that is both industrially militant and politically radical. Like, you're probably not going to succeed with the kind of electoral route. And similarly, without a social movement that is radical and you know, both politically and strategically or tactically. Again, you need both of those things, those buttresses almost, both to put a radical Labour Party in power, make it radical in the first place, then to put it in power. But then crucially, like when you're in power, like that's not the end of the game, like to defend it from the forces of capital, but also to push it further and, you know, almost to be the engine. Like the engine is never going to be the kind of bureaucrats of a Labour Party. The engine of a transformation is going to be people organised en masse. So I think that has to be like our horizon. And I think, you know, the question of can we do this by 2030? Like, honestly, like, you know, probably not. Like, you know, if we're being, I don't want to kind of bullshit people. Like, if we're being really honest, like, we're probably not going to decarbonize by 2030 in this country. And that has like really like fucked up implications for like people here and globally as well. And it's like really sad. And I do think like as a movement, we kind of have to reckon like increasingly that we're going to be trying our best within like a context of like general defeat. And like, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have like ambition and we shouldn't have like a political horizon, like we should, but there does need to be an honest accounting of kind of like where we are just in terms of the realistic timetable of things. But I think, you know, there is hope to be drawn in the fact, you know, I think the pandemic fucked us a little bit, but like 2018, 2019 was like a real insurgency. And I'm really hoping that we see more of that kind of stuff in a way that we kind of can't predict. Like, I think most of us wouldn't have even predicted that like XR would have happened in 2015, 2016, you know, ditto the youth strikes really. Like, I think we kind of like, I hope we'll see more of that stuff of just like formations kind of emerge, and like hopefully we can do a better job, as you were saying before, of like steering them and like radicalizing them. So hopefully we'll see that. I do think we're making progress in the Labour movement. I think even compared to 2-3 years ago, but certainly even further before that, you know, we're seeing trade unions that are much more amenable to, you know, certainly the Green New Deal. There are contradictions to be ironed out, and I think a lot of, you know, it'll always be tougher to kind of converge that last bit the closer we get together. Things like, you know, airport expansion, gas, if you're GMB, you know, things like that will be very difficult to kind of really resolve. But again, I think you're in a position where a lot of people in the trade union movement have gone from being either ambivalent or like actively distrustful of environmentalists to being like, oh no, we kind of do need to reckon with this, you know. So I think we're making progress on that front. And so, you know, we had a moment of like possibility in the Labour Party that's been taken away from us, and as you say, it's not looking good. But you know, it's I think actually, you know, for anyone who is specifically interested in the Labour Party, I think our experience at Labour conference the last week or two was of the left being much stronger than we probably thought we would have been at this point. You know, obviously the leadership did a reasonable job of like stitching things up for themselves, but we won big on policy motions, and you know, there's clearly like a real committed like base of people within the party still like willing to fight, which is really good. So yeah, in terms of like what you should do, like, you know, I guess the kind of the closing bit of the book, I kind of tried to subvert almost the kind of, you know, the thing you get at the end of an event of like, what should I do? It's like, well, you know, stop buying meat and stop flying, and it's always things you should stop doing. I guess what I want to tell you what you should do, touched on it a bit already, but like, you know, you do one of kind of broadly three things, and I don't really care which bit is you do, just as long as you kind of have this like political horizon and the kind of overarching strategy in mind, is like, yeah, join a social movement type thing, whether it's direct action, whether it's youth strike. I think what I'm really interested in is like, what are the constituencies or the bases of people you can mobilize around this? And it's like, I think that, as I said, this is the climate movement's real problem, because it's such a totalizing threat. It's like, there's not an obvious like base of people that any organization would mobilize. So it's like, the reason why the youth strikes I think were so compelling is like, they mobilized young people. Actually, I think one of the reasons why XR was compelling is like, it did a good job of cutting across, but also mobilized quite a lot of boomers. Like, you know, great. And you know, the reason why the labor movement is potentially such an effective force here is like, its base is workers, and workers are kind of like the majority of people. So that's why it's like a compelling strategic thing, as well as like, you know, we need climate change is obviously like a class question, and we need like a working class like led transformation. But yeah, so I think if you're getting involved in social movements, like, yeah, get involved in what's there and try and radicalize it and agitate for it to be bolder, but also have a think about like, what's missing? Like, am I involved in a community that could be organized along these lines? And try and experiment with that. And then, yeah, if not that, you know, if you're so inclined, I honestly, I think, you know, you kind of get this thing on the left of like, join a union, just like join it every time there's like anything bad at work, like join a union. It's like, yeah, join a union, but also like agitate within it, because our actually existing union movement isn't where it needs to be. But trade unions are the kind of enduring organizations of the working class in this country, and like, we kind of got them, and we should really make the most of them, and we should really agitate for them to be better. So join a union, organize your workplace, agitate within the union for it to be more militant and more radical. And then, yeah, finally, if you can stomach it, you know, and I'm not going to sell you a false dream here, but like, if you can stomach it, like join the Labour Party and organize for it, because honestly, I do think that as awful as it might be at times, and as, you know, unattractive and as unsexy as it might be, you know, under Keith's leadership, it is important for the main opposition party and the Social Democratic Party in this country to have like bold climate policies, and for the left within it to be strong. And it's a kind of like, yeah, every little helps situation. So that would be it. And I think for me, the book is like, it's not a kind of like, this is exactly what should happen, or like, you know, it's not a kind of like blueprint exactly for winning climate justice, but I do hope that it's an intervention that draws on my experience in different bits of the movement, that almost kind of, yeah, I hope people will take it and be inspired to do something about it. And that's kind of the point. As you said before, there's a lot of books that kind of, you know, and a lot of them are very good books that are like manifestos, or are, you know, very precise like diagnoses of the problem. You know, I do some of that, but I think, you know, if people read this book, and I hope they do, what I want you to take from it is, well, you know, if no one else, you know, who else is going to take action in this way, if not you, the person who's just read this book. So yeah, I very much hope people do that.
And so do I, because I think this is now a question of strategy as opposed to ideas. We have the ideas on the left, and we should be very confident about having those ideas. There are more ideas, of course, and always new lessons to be learned about everything. But the questions of strategy, the questions of power, the questions of state power in particular are incredibly, incredibly important. And I hope we will talk about that more on different platforms. But thank you very much to Housmans for hosting us. I'm going to leave you with the question that we've got in the chat, Chris, and pose that to you before finally wrapping up. And that is in from Sid, and he says, how do we combat gaslighting by almost all media outlets? And what are your thoughts on the Rush legislation clamping down on the right to protest?
Yeah, I mean, on media, I guess, you know, plugs for all our comrades building radical alternative media, the likes of Novara, the likes of Tribune, the likes of Red Pepper, lots of others. It's all important work. But also I think, you know, yeah, there needs to be a sense of like, we should seek to subvert like the media whenever we can, get on it, put a message on it, but like, you know, also not rely on it. And we should build our own communication channels, whether it's through those alternative forms, whether it's through social media, or whether it's through mobilizing in the streets. And I think there's something to like, you know, again, you know, obviously Jeremy Corbyn didn't win general elections, unfortunately, but he did do a very good job of convincing quite a lot of people to vote for him, despite essentially like a war being waged on him by the billionaire-owned media class. So it's like, you know, we can communicate with people by taking action through our own, yeah, we can create our own space. But we need a mass movement to do that. You know, you can't have, you know, if you're kind of like marginal, like cell, like direct action cell, as useful as that might be in some types, like in some moments, you're relying on a kind of media to like pick up on your action and like disseminate it for you. You need a mass movement of people if you're to like subvert or like work around, I should say, the billionaire-owned media. So that's the first thing. And then, yeah, the very last thing on the law. Yeah, I mean, the protest laws are like incredibly difficult. I mean, we're under an incredibly repressive, increasingly emboldened authoritarian Tory government, which, yeah, as you say, is not only not doing what is needed on the climate crisis, it is actively repressing people who are trying to get it to do so. I think my answer to this would be twofold. I mean, I guess, you know, you kind of have to, in some ways you have to adapt probably. Like, you know, is it great to have a load of our people in prison? Like, no. But also you probably need to push it as well. And like, you know, I think throughout history, we've seen people rebel against authoritarian governments, and, you know, ultimately, if you're on the side of justice or whatever, you can make a very compelling case for yourself around that. But also, again, I think, and again, this isn't to like undervalue like the work of people who are taking direct action or who are being repressed in this way, but I think in some ways you need to build a mass movement that isn't reliant on like people putting themselves in arrestable situations. Like there's only, you know, I think there's only so much of like a churn through the courts or the prison system like a movement can kind of take, and like that should certainly be a part of it, and it should be deployed strategically. But ultimately I think this is a thing of like working through institutions like the Labour movement, the Labour Party, whatever other institutions of civil society might be useful to us. It's a kind of like, it's a way of like sustaining your struggle and like building power. And I think the more power we build, the stronger we are when we then like deploy direct action. And so if you remain a relatively small or marginal movement and deploy direct action, then you're going to be crushed quite quickly. But if you're a mass movement, then all of a sudden there's so much more behind you when you do choose to take direct action in those like strategically useful moments. So that's why I'd say, you know, whatever your inclination around whether to take direct action or not, or whatever your thoughts on this, on the repression, like building a bigger movement, a stronger movement, a popular movement is you know, helps us either way.
Amazing. Well, I think that is quite a good place to end. So thank you very much, Chris, for tonight, and also for writing the book. And thank you to Housmans for hosting, yeah, there it is, this brilliant event. So yeah, I think these are, I hope everybody's taken something from this, because for me, it's been really fascinating. I don't think, you know, Chris and I, well, I know Chris and I don't agree on everything, particularly I think when it comes to direct action and other forms of civil disobedience. But for me, Chris is asking all of the right questions. And these are questions that as a climate movement and wider labour movements, we need to really be concertedly getting around the table and thinking through in a very serious way. So thanks so much for having this conversation with me and Chris. I hope this can continue on various other platforms, and have a lovely rest of your evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Chris.